Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm delighted and honored to be here. I suppose in terms of this conversation, what I really want to focus on is actually the digital discourse that we're in the middle of is much larger than I think the kind of conversation of skills. And I want to challenge the discussion a little bit. One, I want to say that if you look back in history, the moment we're in the middle of is probably a moment of a great transition. Everyone talks about digital as it's something that's just coming and we'll see economic growth. In fact, perhaps the biggest issue is we're probably in the biggest destruction of value that we're about to see in the next 10 to 12 years that we've ever seen in life. So if you look at the impacts of climate change, you're going to see the most structured destruction of value that we've ever seen. And if you want to look at the next 10 to 15 years, actually we should be looking at all these things in the round. Look at the impacts of automation. Yes, we're going to see actually massive amounts of value being created, but we're also going to see massive disruption in existing labor markets. How does this future pan out? And I think it's really important to think about these transitions in fundamentally different ways. Historically, people often think about great technologies as being about the technology and the innovation of the private sector. In fact, if you look back at history, if you look at the history of any form of industrial revolution, what you see is industrial revolution happens almost in parallel with institutional reform, radical institutional reform. So the first industrial revolution that happened in the UK happened at the same time, actually a few years before, educational reform had already happened. So if we want to genuinely talk about a transition in a new economy, we have to think much larger and broader to the conversation. And the challenge will be, if we think that this is all about a few computers being given out to kids, we can solve the problem, I think we're missing the point. The transition is much more structured. Why is that important? Because if you look at, say, the impacts of air pollution, I'm just going to pick impacts of air pollution. Air pollution takes out 1 year of cognitive performance, 1 year of learning of children. 1 year. So if you want to have the children of the next 21st century, what you're going to have to do is talk about how do you build the environment that's going to build the cognitive capabilities of the 21st century. This is not just a question of actually just giving people laptops. It's about creating the right environment for actually children to have the cognitive capabilities. You can go further, whether it's noise pollution. We know noise pollution itself, actually low levels of noise pollution, actually introduces stress, which actually takes up to 5 years of people's lives. We know already food nutrition globally is declining. The quality of food and the nutrition quality of food is declining, which takes up to 13 IQ points of children and adults. 13 IQ points is the equivalent of being a scientist or not in many places. And I'm just talking about the base biological infrastructure. So if we want to start to think about how do we digitize the Western Balkans, I think we have to think much broader and deeper. That's step one. How do you create the biological context? The next context is actually how do you create the welfare institutions of the 21st century? Welfare is actually an infrastructure to unlock human development. Financial stress, if I was to put anyone under financial stress, significant financial stress, actually their IQ capability diminishes. So if you look at any universal basic income trial, what are they there for? What they're unlocking is mental health capabilities. They're there to unlock mental health capabilities. So when you look at this institutional infrastructure, you have to start to biological. What's the welfare institutions? I think the conversation of schools is nowhere near strong enough. I don't think any schools are yet dealing with how do you build the creativity, the cognitive capabilities, actually the discovery capacity, the agile intelligence models that are fundamental for this new economy. So we've talked about welfare, we've talked about institutional infrastructure. Then let's talk about government. Government in the 21st century will be fundamentally different to how it is. Regulation. At the same time, when you look back at the UK or any of the big industrial revolutions when they happened, actually we were reimagining standards at the same time as what was being reimagined was technologies. Look at the role of China. China understood something very clearly in Yan Yan's book on actually how China escaped the poverty trap. It created agile regulatory capacity. So regulation was evolving continuously at the same time as innovations were happening. This symbiotic capacity of agile regulation to be able to deal with the 21st century. Because regulation is not a control on business. Regulation is actually a framework of preserving open, fair markets, which are fundamental to monopoly access. So when you talk about digital economies, let's also recognize pretty much every smart city that's ever been made, every smart city increases inequality. That's the current facts. Smart cities increase inequality. If you want to change that, you have to start to think much more fundamentally about changing the infrastructure for that. What's the institutional infrastructure? So most modern businesses, when you look at their business models, they're still about actually, so Facebook, let's be really honest, Facebook is fundamentally a natural monopoly. It functions better and better by being a monopoly. Most platforms work really well when they're natural monopolies. How do you structure corporate information, corporate structures for natural monopolies? If the Western Balkans want to lead, they have to build the new legal companies for platform economies. So you need new institutional infrastructures for this new economy. I was just out in Canada, just literally arrived this morning from Canada. That's the conversation. The limited liability company was born for our industrial age. If you want to lead the world, reinvent the limited liability company. It doesn't work in an interdependent, complex world. If you want to reimagine platform economies, build the infrastructure, a corporate which allows for natural monopolies to occur whilst preserving the public good. How do you build businesses which decentralize creativity? We were fortunate enough to build OpenDesk or WikiHouse. OpenDesk is a decentralized open source production of furniture. You can print the furniture anywhere in the world. Literally anywhere in the world. Within 7 miles, you can get it printed and delivered, the furniture. When we did that, what was the thing that we recognized? We recognized we wanted to allow for personalization of the furniture in San Francisco. In order to allow for the personalization of furniture in San Francisco, what we had to create was a completely different type of business model. The decentralized creativity of the people producing the furniture in San Francisco was important. So we had to reinvent quality assurance to allow for decentralized models of creativity. That's fundamentally about building additive insurance or additive warranties. So if you look back at the infrastructure for decentralized, not just production, but decentralized creativity on the basis of technology, you end up with fundamentally different economies. You can do this with a bakery. A friend of mine is doing this with a bakery, where she's got an incredible bakery, and she's allowing other bakeries to effectively be connected to all the recipes, all the learning of her platform. So you can have decentralized ownership at the same time, as well as having shared infrastructures. So the new businesses that we're seeing are fundamentally different. Bertsurger, amazing business. Neighborhood care business, 10,000 nurses. At the same time, 100 people in headquarters. That's it. 100 people in HQ. Why? Because there's a fantastic structural platform at the back end of it. There's no middle management. So the biggest destruction of jobs you're going to see is not manual labor, it's administration. Uber didn't destroy the taxi driver. Uber destroyed administration. What we're seeing is the disruption of bureaucracy. And that will fundamentally change the value relationship between how value is produced, and value has to be produced closer to the source. So what we're going to see is different types of business models as well as different types of businesses. But fundamentally, this also needs different models of regulation, and not regulation in a bad way. So we're doing work around looking at the future of planning. Urban planning has been still done on static models of planning zoning. Actually, we can do real-time licensing on geofence landscapes. We can geofence environments, a house, this place, and we can do it time-based. So reinventing the planning rules, also the regulatory landscape, opens up capacity to reimagine how the city is used, owned, taxed. What happens with property rights? You can reimagine property rights. We're unbundling property rights between future uses, current uses, resource uses in terms of energy production. These can be unbundled and traded separately. So technology is unbundling the cost of being able to hold property rights and infrastructure. The big point I really want to make, and I think this is the number one point for me, if we're talking about the transfer to a digital economy, we have to see this problem not through only the lens of startups and corporates. It is fundamentally a transition in every aspect of society. Your biological conditions, food, nutrition, water quality, all the way through to air quality. Because without that, you will not have the human capital to build that new economy. You need to reimagine welfare. You need to reimagine the ability of state. Even the best states in the world actually struggle to be able to, I don't know about here, but I would say in Montreal, and virtually no state can actually even take the data from Uber and analyze the data from Uber. Can you do that? Can a state look at the data from Uber, analyze the algorithms? No. Does it even understand the biases that those algorithms have inside it? How can you govern if you don't have the capacity to even understand it? And that capacity is not a talent problem. You haven't got the talent. You need the infrastructure and you need the capability. And good governance is not a threat on good business. Good governance is a boon for good business because it actually creates the standards and the capability and the trust required for that business to be stable and available. So how do you build that? And I think these are fundamental questions. So my big message is this, exactly what I've been saying. Digital transformation is not going to be just about startups or corporates. Anyone tells you that, they're missing the point. Look back at the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't just about the steam engine. Actually, it was about standards organizations. It was about Encyclopedia Britannica. It was about British Standards Institute. It was about schools. It was about housing for the poor. It was a fundamental transition in society. Now, that can seem daunting, but actually, that's the scale of transition we're in. At the same time, what we're witnessing is a massive destruction of, I think, of value. Look at the impacts of climate change. You may all choose to ignore it currently. Already the feds in the US are starting to say future costs, future liabilities are going to start cascading on current asset prices. New York, Miami, Singapore, many states are now vulnerable in strategic senses. That destruction of assets is going to be significant. Carry on looking further into the forward. Over the next 10 to 12 years, you're seeing the rise of, whether it's Brexit or Trump, you're seeing the rise of significant models of nationalism. What will that do to outsourcing economies? If you go to Vietnam, what's the conversation? People are worried about reshoring. All those businesses that were outsourced being reshored back in. I think it's fundamental that we start to look at this stuff strategically and in depth. And if nothing else, what China proves and other places prove, that it's possible to do this. Singapore is a great example of an economy over 50 years which has done extraordinarily well. And is being able to build the strategic infrastructure to grow that economy. And in Singapore, 80% of the housing is publicly owned. 80% is publicly owned housing in Singapore. So how do we do it? And I think this, to me, is really the challenge. And if we're going to talk about this, I think this has got to be the strategic turning point in the conversation. So that's really my big conversation. The great transition, as we call it, you can see other names for it, this is not going to be a time for just actually playing around with a few infrastructures. You're going to look at some of the depth of it. How do you finance this stuff? How do you finance public value? We're already seeing reuses of new materials. So we're looking at, for example, smart covenants, which allow you to, a state school, I don't know about if this is true here, maybe some of you would tell me, a state school in the UK makes local houses go up in value, a good state school. Right? A good state school increases the private value of a house. Can you rebalance this relationship? Yes, you can, using smart covenants, where you link the uplift in value to private housing back to funding the state school. That's possible using new contractual infrastructures. The High Line in New York, many of you will know it, increased property value by 5 times adjacent to that High Line. 5 times. How do you relink the value back? Well, you can do that. So there are new business models emerging of funding common goods and common infrastructure. I think the future is there. I think the challenge is it is in the interest of very few people to talk about it at a structural level. But I guarantee you, this conversation, I've had this conversation in places like Vietnam, had this conversations in places like India, had this conversations in Far East countries, and they are dealing at it at that integrated level. The biggest challenge is that in Europe, we don't want to have this integrated conversation. We think we can deal with it at one layer. We think government will be the same as it is. Even when BMW were trying to produce the electric Mini, right? BMW were trying to produce it. They tried for 3 years inside the existing organization, and they couldn't do it. So they set up a separate company to produce the electric Mini. The first time they'd set up a separate company. And in that, they produced the electric Mini in 9 months. If you want a digital state, the best thing to do is to set up a separate digital state and port every your services directly across. You will not be able to do it from within, even if you're talking about cities. So how do you build this transition infrastructure? It's really important you do it. It won't be done by just facilitating a few technologies. The only thing that will be done is value will be held by very few, and you will see the monopolization of value in the hands of even fewer people. And that will long-term undermine your ability to make the transition. No country with high levels of Gini coefficient has ever been able to stabilize and be able to grow that economy. The reason why the UK was #1 in Industrial Revolution, because wealth was more evenly distributed than effectively Amsterdam and Holland. The distribution of wealth is fundamental in these transition times because you need the capability for everyone to innovate. You do not know who the winners will be. So the distribution of wealth and the distribution of capability is fundamental for the distribution of innovation. The other thing, innovation has to happen throughout the whole economy. The big risk here is we focus on a few unicorns. And actually that will never pass through wealth through the whole society. Again, look back at Industrial Revolution. What do you see? Prizes were being awarded for innovation every point in the chain, all the way to people reinventing brushes to clean factories faster so there would be lower risk of fire. Innovation has to be a culture that goes all the way through. And if you want to adapt an innovation economy, you then have to recognize that you are in the co-production of risk. Innovation is fundamentally about the co-production of risk. Our regulation models are all designed ex ante. I understand the problem and I ban it. That world will never re-emerge again. We are no longer going to be ex ante able to predict what the failures will be. The failures of Facebook in year 1 to the failures of Facebook in year 20 were completely different. It's a completely different business model. It went from being an advertising company to a societal bias company. How would a regulator regulate it? So you have to build a completely different model of regulation and governance, which is agile and iterative to the companies as they're evolving. That requires building regulatory sandboxes. That requires building civic legitimacy. Only if you build the institutional infrastructure can we make the transition. That's my one big plea. And the other thing is, please, stop thinking about the region from here. Go to Shenzhen, go to China, go to Taiwan. You will have a completely different view of how they look at problems. They look at problems at a structural level. And my big worry across Europe, America, and Canada, we're still looking at problems from, oh, we'll just add a little bit of digital everywhere, and it'll all be fine. A little paste of digital. It's not going to work. A digital transfer is a fundamental change in our society and our economy, and you have to embrace it fundamentally. Otherwise, we as a region, and we as a region more globally, will not be able to make the transition. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. That is my challenge to you, and I think it's possible. You have the institutional infrastructure, you have leaders here, you have amazing people in the room. I think it's absolutely critical that you do it. With that, I thank you for your patience. I'm really sorry for my slides, which weren't able to be shown, but I do apologize and thank you for listening to me. Thank you.